He thought he was just tying a little girl's shoelaces, until her name made his entire past come crashing back. Manhattan was slipping into its evening rhythm, the kind of rhythm where the city lights seemed to hum in harmony with the steady pulse of traffic. Storefronts glowed in warm amber tones, neon signs blinked lazily, and the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a street cart drifted on the crisp autumn air. James Caldwell, a man whose name often appeared in business magazines and whose schedule was normally guarded like a state secret, walked briskly down the sidewalk toward the black limousine waiting at the curb. His phone was still in his hand, the last echoes of a tense conference call fading from his mind, when something caught his attention on the edge of the park. Just a few feet from the entrance, a small figure sat hunched on the curb, her thin shoulders trembling. A group of children was disappearing into the distance, their laughter carrying back like cruel little echoes. James slowed his pace, frowning, his gaze locking on the girl. She was no more than 5 years old, her blonde hair catching the glow of a nearby street lamp like spun gold. Her small hands fumbled desperately at the laces of her bright pink sneakers, tugging and twisting but failing to form the loops. Each failed attempt made her breath hitch, and when she finally dropped her hands into her lap, tears streaked down her pale cheeks. James hesitated for only a moment before stepping toward her, the sharp click of his polished shoes softened by the damp pavement. He crouched down so they were eye to eye, the towering city fading into the background. His voice came out gentler than he had expected, almost tentative. "Hey there, having a bit of trouble?" The girl lifted her head, her blue eyes wide and glassy, searching his face as if trying to decide whether he was safe. She didn't speak, just gave the smallest of nods. Without another word, James reached forward, taking the untidy laces into his hands. His fingers moved with deliberate care, not rushing the task, the way someone might when they know the act itself is more important than how quickly it's done. When the bow was neatly tied, he gave one lace a light tug to test it. "There," he said, smiling softly. "That should hold for a while." It was a small smile that bloomed on her face in return, but it was genuine, fragile yet warm. For James, it was strangely disarming. He had closed multi-million-dollar deals, spoken on global stages, and navigated crises that would have crushed other executives. Yet in that moment, kneeling on a sidewalk in the fading light, it felt as if the most important thing he had done all year was to tie a little girl's shoes. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost shy, as if unused to being heard. "My name's Lily." James didn't know it yet, but in that single moment, on that unremarkable curb, with the city roaring around them, his life had begun to change in ways he could never have predicted. They sat there for a moment, the street lamp above them casting a faint halo around the small space they shared. The sound of the city kept rolling in waves, car horns, distant music, hurried footsteps, but James found himself strangely disconnected from it all. He didn't usually linger with strangers, especially not in public, and yet there was something about the little girl that held him in place. She had tucked her feet beneath her now, as if protecting the freshly tied laces, and her small hands worried at the hem of her denim jacket. He asked where she lived, the question slipping out without thought, and she told him about a house far outside the city, the way the walls creaked when the wind blew, and how the roof leaked when it rained. She spoke with the blunt honesty of a child, unfiltered and plain, but never once sounding like she was asking for pity. There was a quiet resilience in the way she described her life, as though hardship was simply a fact she had learned to live alongside. When he asked about her parents, her gaze dropped to the ground. She told him her mother had died a few years ago, and that she had never met her father. She said it in a voice too steady for a 5-year-old, as though she had told the story enough times to make it feel like a distant truth rather than an open wound. James felt something heavy settle in his chest. He tried to keep his face neutral, though a faint ache crept into his expression. It was then that he asked, almost casually, what her full name was. The girl's eyes lifted to meet his again, their blues so bright they seemed to catch the light even in the shadows. "Lily Clark," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. The sound of it hit him like a sudden drop in temperature. He felt his pulse quicken, a strange and unwelcome tightness gripping his throat. Clark. It was a name he had not spoken in years, a name tied to a part of his life he had buried beneath deadlines, acquisitions, and the sterile glamour of boardrooms. Emily Clark. The woman who had once been his entire world before he let ambition push her away. In a rush, fragments of memory returned, the way Emily's laughter would linger in a room, the stubborn tilt of her chin when she challenged him, the softness in her voice on the rare nights when they both forgot the rest of the world existed. He remembered the fight, sharp words spoken in the heat of frustration, his own pride drawing a wall between them that neither dared to climb. She had left the city without warning, and he had told himself it was for the best. For years, he believed it. Or at least tried to. Now, looking at this small, fair-haired girl with eyes the same impossible shade of blue as Emily's, he felt the edges of that carefully constructed distance begin to crumble. Questions rose faster than he could process them. Could it be? Was it even possible? He tried to study her without making it obvious, noticing the faint curl in her hair, the way her lips curved when she was uncertain, little details that felt so familiar they made his stomach twist. She said nothing more, content to sit there beside him, swinging her feet lightly above the pavement. But the name hung between them, charged with meaning she could not possibly understand. James forced a smile and asked her what she liked to do for fun, trying to keep his voice light, but his mind was far away, tangled in a past he thought he'd left behind. As she chattered about drawing flowers in the dirt behind her house and how she liked to pretend the clouds were giant animals, James felt the strange, inescapable pull of fate. He had come down this street by pure coincidence, a man too busy to notice anything outside his own tightly managed schedule, and yet here he was, sitting with a child who carried a name, and perhaps something far greater, that could rewrite everything he thought he knew about his life. And deep down, in a place he wasn't ready to admit even to himself, he already feared the answer to the question forming in his mind. That night, James lay in his apartment surrounded by silence, the kind of silence that didn't comfort but pressed in from all sides. The skyline glowed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed the city he had once claimed to love. His mind was tangled, replaying the scene in the park over and over, each detail etched sharper with every recollection, the way Lily's voice sounded when she said her name, the glint of her eyes under the street lamp, the small hesitation before she trusted him enough to let him tie her laces. He kept coming back to the last name, Clark, and each time it struck like a physical blow. He had told himself that Emily was a closed chapter, a memory that belonged to a younger, more reckless version of himself, but the truth was she had never really left him. Her ghost had lingered quietly in the back of his mind for years, resurfacing in unexpected moments, always pulling at the edges of his thoughts before he pushed it away again. He remembered the night they parted, how the argument had begun with something trivial, he couldn't even recall the trigger, but had spiraled into an indictment of their entire relationship. Emily had accused him of caring more about his next promotion than about them, of measuring life only in terms of progress and profit. He had accused her of not understanding the pressure he was under, the sacrifices he needed to make. In the end, she had packed her things while he stood there, too proud to stop her, convincing himself it was better to let her go than admit he was wrong. After she left, he told his friends he was fine, told himself that she would have only been an anchor holding him back. The truth was harder to admit, he missed her every day, but instead of facing that, he drowned himself in work, building a career so vast and consuming there was no room for regret. Still, in quiet moments, he would find himself wondering where she had gone, whether she was happy, whether she ever thought of him. Now, with Lily's face fresh in his memory, all those buried questions came rushing back, but with a sharper edge. The timing was possible, painfully possible. He did the math in his head, counting back the years. Lily was about 5. That would have been just after Emily vanished from his life. He couldn't stop imagining what Emily must have gone through if she had been pregnant then, alone and far from him. He tried to picture her holding a baby, her smile softened in that way he remembered from quieter days, and the image both warmed and tore at him. He rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling, and felt a gnawing mixture of guilt and longing. If Lily was his daughter, then he had missed her first steps, her first words, the years when a father's presence meant everything. He imagined her birthdays without him there, school days where she faced the world without a hand to hold, nights when she might have cried herself to sleep not knowing she had another parent somewhere in the world. The thought made his chest tighten until it almost hurt. James was not a man given to uncertainty, his career had thrived on decisive action, but this was different. Every instinct told him to find out the truth, to track down whoever was caring for Lily and see if there was any connection to Emily that went beyond coincidence. But another part of him feared what he might discover, feared the confirmation that would bring with it the crushing weight of responsibility and the realization that his choices years ago had shaped a life he hadn't even known existed. He got up and poured himself a drink, though it did nothing to steady him. Outside, the city buzzed and glittered, a reminder of the life he had built and the fortress of control he had wrapped around himself. For the first time in years, he felt that fortress crack. Somewhere out there, a little girl with Emily's eyes had tied herself into his life without knowing it, and he understood, with a clarity that unsettled him, that nothing would be the same after that chance meeting. The following morning, James woke with a sense of determination that felt almost foreign to him, the kind of conviction that wasn't about contracts or quarterly goals but about something far more personal. He had spent most of the night weighing the risks of what he was about to do, but in the end, the pull of needing to know was stronger than any fear. By mid-morning, he had found a way to trace the girl's location through a contact who owed him a favor. It wasn't difficult, the world was far smaller when you had the means to navigate it. The address was scrawled on a slip of paper he kept turning over in his hand as his driver navigated the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was a far cry from the polished towers of Manhattan. Here, the houses were older, leaning a little under the weight of years, their paint faded and roofs patched with mismatched shingles. His car stood out immediately, sleek and foreign against the cracked asphalt and overgrown lawns. He stepped out and took in the small white house at the end of the street, its porch sagging slightly, a line of potted plants struggling to survive along the railing. For a moment, he hesitated at the foot of the steps, feeling like an intruder about to cross into a world where he might not be welcome. When the door opened, it was answered by an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her eyes were sharp despite the deep lines around them, and she studied him with a guarded wariness that made him straighten instinctively. She didn't invite him in right away. Instead, she asked who he was and why he was there, her voice firm but not unkind. James introduced himself carefully, explaining that he had met Lily in the park the previous evening. He spoke her name softly, as if testing her reaction, and saw something shift in the woman's expression. She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter, leading him into a modest living room that smelled faintly of old books and chamomile tea. The furniture was worn but clean, the walls lined with photographs, most of them of Lily at various ages. He found himself drawn to a framed picture on a shelf, a much younger Emily holding an infant swaddled in a blanket, her smile bright but her eyes carrying a depth he recognized instantly. The woman noticed where he was looking and set a cup of tea in front of him before sitting down across from him. There was no ceremony in the way she spoke, she simply told him the truth. Emily had passed away 5 years ago, taken suddenly by an illness that had left no time for goodbyes. Lily had been barely old enough to understand, and since then, she had lived with her grandmother in this small house. Then came the words that made James feel as if the air had been pulled from the room. Lily was his daughter. Emily had always meant to tell him, but she never did, convinced that he was too consumed by his work and that stepping back into his life might only cause more pain. James sat there in silence, his mind reeling, his hands tightening around the cup though he hadn't touched the tea. 1,000 emotions surged at once, guilt for the years he had missed, grief for Emily, and a fragile, unfamiliar hope at the thought of what this could mean. The woman's voice softened as she told him that Lily knew nothing about who he was, and that if he intended to be in her life, it needed to be for the right reasons. Money would not fix what the girl needed most. Love, consistency, patience, those were the things her granddaughter had been missing, and those were the things James would have to decide if he was willing to give. He left the house with his thoughts in turmoil, the quiet weight of Emily's absence heavy on his shoulders. But beneath the grief and regret, there was something else, an unshakable resolve forming, the certainty that he could not walk away from this now that he knew the truth. In the days that followed his visit to the small white house, James found himself slipping into a routine that was both deliberate and cautious. He didn't want to overwhelm Lily or disrupt the fragile balance of her life, so he approached from the edges, finding small ways to be present without announcing himself as anything more than a friendly face. He began stopping by the park on his way home from work, timing his visits so they would coincide with the moments she played on the swings or crouched in the grass with a notebook, sketching flowers and small animals. Sometimes he would sit nearby, pretending to read, while keeping just enough distance so she could choose whether to engage. Gradually, she did, first with shy glances, then with questions, and eventually with stories about her day, each one offered as if she were testing the safety of his interest. At the same time, he worked quietly with her grandmother to ease some of the burdens they carried. The roof was repaired after a particularly heavy rainstorm, though he made sure the work was arranged anonymously so it would feel like a stroke of good fortune rather than a handout. New clothes appeared in Lily's wardrobe, simple and practical, chosen with care so they wouldn't draw too much attention at school. When he tried to offer more direct help, her grandmother pushed back firmly, reminding him that Lily didn't need to be dazzled with material things. What she needed was stability, someone who would show up consistently and mean it. That challenge struck him more deeply than he admitted aloud, because showing up, truly being there for someone, was not a skill his career had trained him for. He began to notice details about Lily that made him think of Emily in ways that were both comforting and painful. There was a spark in the way she argued her point, even when it was over something as small as the rules of a game. She had the same tilt to her head when she was curious, the same tendency to drift into thought when she was listening to music or watching the clouds. Yet there were also pieces of her he didn't recognize at all, parts that had formed entirely without him, shaped by her grandmother, her friends, and the quiet resilience born from a life that had not been easy. The more time he spent with her, the more he began to see how she navigated the small cruelties of childhood. She never mentioned the teasing directly, but he caught glimpses of it in the way she hesitated to join certain groups at the park, or how her smile tightened when other children showed off new backpacks or expensive shoes. She didn't complain, but he could feel the weight of it in the way she straightened her back, as if daring the world to notice her for something other than what she lacked. One afternoon, as they sat on the grass sharing a paper bag of warm pretzels, she told him in a matter-of-fact tone that she wanted to be someone important when she grew up, not so people would like her more, but so no one would be able to laugh at her again. The words hit him harder than he expected, and he found himself fighting the urge to promise her the world right there and then. Instead, he asked her what being important meant to her, and she answered without hesitation, it meant being someone people listened to, someone who could help others. Her answer stayed with him long after he dropped her off at home. That night, he thought about how easily he could give her the material security she didn't have, and yet how difficult it was to give her what she truly wanted, confidence, dignity, and the knowledge that she mattered. He realized that his role couldn't be limited to financial support or occasional kindness. If he was going to step into her life, it had to be with the intention of helping her build the foundation she deserved, even if that meant reshaping the way he had lived his own life up until now. It was a daunting realization, one that came with the uncomfortable awareness that he would have to change as much as she would. But as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, James understood that this was not the kind of challenge he could walk away from. The small, stubborn voice of a 5-year-old in a denim jacket had already rooted itself in his life, and the thought of losing that voice was one he couldn't bear to imagine. It happened suddenly, with no warning, on a gray afternoon when the air felt heavy and the wind carried the smell of rain. James had just left a meeting when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was trembling. It was Lily's grandmother, and she was speaking so quickly that it took him several seconds to understand her. Lily was in the hospital. She had collapsed at school, and the teachers had called an ambulance. They didn't know what was wrong yet, but it was serious. The sound of panic in the woman's voice cut through him like nothing else could. Without thinking, he left his car idling in the street and told his driver to head straight for the hospital. When he arrived, the corridors were bright but cold, smelling faintly of antiseptic and metal. He found the grandmother sitting stiffly in a hard plastic chair, her hands knotted together in her lap. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady as she explained that Lily had a heart condition, one Emily had known about but had kept quiet from most people. It had never caused major problems before, but now the doctors were saying she needed surgery, and soon. Without it, her condition could worsen quickly. James felt a sharp, almost physical pain in his chest as he listened, the words folding over him in waves. He wanted to demand that the doctors fix it immediately, but the truth was more complicated. The procedure was expensive and would require specialists. Time mattered, but so did resources. In that moment, the question of cost felt absurd. He had spent his adult life surrounded by deals that involved obscene amounts of money, but none of those transactions had ever carried this kind of weight. He made a call from the hospital lobby, his voice clipped and urgent, instructing his financial advisor to liquidate a portion of his company's shares. He didn't care about the market implications or the headlines it might generate. All that mattered was that the hospital had the green light to move forward without hesitation. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of hospital rooms, muted conversations with doctors, and the constant beeping of machines that monitored Lily's fragile heartbeat. James stayed by her side whenever they would let him, sleeping in a stiff chair in the corner of her room, waking each time she stirred or whispered something in her sleep. She looked so small in the bed, her blonde hair fanned across the pillow, her skin pale against the white sheets. He kept thinking about the years he had missed. How many moments like this had belonged to someone else, how many times she had needed comfort and he hadn't been there to give it. There were moments when her eyes would flutter open and find his, and she would smile faintly, as if to tell him she wasn't afraid. Those were the moments that broke him in ways he didn't expect. He had faced hostile takeovers, public scandals, and the collapse of major deals without letting anyone see him falter, but sitting here, watching a 5-year-old fight for her life, stripped away every layer of armor he had built. When the day of the surgery came, the wait felt endless. He paced the hallway outside the operating room, the soles of his shoes tracing the same narrow path over and over until his legs ached. Her grandmother sat silently nearby, her rosary slipping through her fingers in a rhythm that seemed to measure time. Every time the doors opened and a nurse stepped out, James' head would snap up, his pulse quickening, only to sink again when it wasn't news about Lily. Hours later, when the surgeon finally emerged, his expression was calm. The operation had gone well, and Lily was stable. Relief washed over James so intensely that he had to steady himself against the wall. He thanked the doctor, though the words felt too small for the gratitude he felt. He didn't care that the process had cost him a small fortune, that the decision would ripple through his professional life in ways he couldn't yet predict. All that mattered was that she would wake up, that she would have the chance to grow, to run, to live the kind of life that might have been cut short if he hadn't been there in time. That night, sitting by her bed while she slept peacefully for the first time in days, James realized something that unsettled him in its simplicity. He had once believed his wealth and power were the markers of his worth, the proof that he had succeeded. Now, with the soft sound of her breathing filling the quiet room, he understood that none of it meant anything compared to being here, to making sure she never had to face the world alone again. A week after the surgery, Lily was well enough to return home, her step still small and careful but her spirit brighter than it had been in months. James visited almost every day, bringing board games, picture books, and sometimes nothing more than his company. He had begun to notice that she expected him now, that her eyes would search the doorway when the doorbell rang, and he couldn't deny the warmth that rose in him each time she lit up at the sight of him. It was during one of those visits, when Lily was napping in the small bedroom at the end of the hall, that her grandmother quietly asked him to stay a moment after she woke. Her tone was steady, but something in her gaze told him this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. When Lily's soft breathing faded into the background, the grandmother disappeared into another room and returned carrying a worn cardboard box. It was taped at the edges and had the faint musty smell of things kept for too long. She set it on the coffee table and, without a word, pushed it toward him. James hesitated before opening it, his fingers brushing the brittle tape as if the act itself required permission. Inside were stacks of envelopes, some neatly bundled with ribbon, others loose and worn at the corners. He recognized Emily's handwriting immediately, the looping curves of her letters, the way her ink sometimes pressed darker into the paper as if she had written with emotion she couldn't contain. He pulled one from the top of the pile and unfolded it slowly. It was addressed to him, but the postmark was years old. The letter began without preamble, Emily's words spilling onto the page in a way that felt both urgent and intimate. She told him she had tried to reach him after she left but hadn't known how to bridge the distance his silence had created. She explained that she hadn't wanted to disrupt his life, that she knew how hard he had worked for everything he had achieved, but there was something he needed to know. Lily was his daughter. She wrote about the day she found out she was pregnant, the fear she had felt, and the stubborn hope that one day he might be ready to be part of their lives. "If you're reading this," she wrote in one of the final paragraphs, "it means I didn't get to tell you in person. But I hope you'll find her, and when you do, I hope you'll love her the way I know you can." James read the letter twice, then a third time, each word sinking deeper until it felt as though his chest was too tight to draw breath. The guilt that had already been stirring in him since meeting Lily now swelled into something heavier, sharper, and more permanent. All the years he had thought of Emily as a closed chapter were suddenly rewritten into something else entirely, a story he had walked away from without realizing it had continued without him. He imagined her alone in the moments she described, imagined her holding their child for the first time, making decisions on her own, carrying burdens he should have shared. He set the letter down with shaking hands and looked at the grandmother, who was watching him with a quiet understanding that made him feel even more exposed. She told him she had considered giving him the box years ago but had decided against it, unsure if he would have done anything differently back then. Now, after seeing him with Lily, she thought perhaps the time was right. She reminded him again that Lily didn't know who he was and that if he planned to tell her, it should be when he was certain he could commit to the role completely. There was no place in her life for someone who might walk away again. James sat there for a long time after she left the room, staring at the box and feeling the weight of the past pressing in from all sides. The regret was almost unbearable, but beneath it, something else was taking shape, a kind of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The decision was no longer about whether he wanted to be involved. It was about accepting that he already was, that every choice from this moment forward would shape not only her life but his own. As he left that night, carrying the letter folded neatly in his coat pocket, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, turning away was no longer an option. 2 years passed, and the sharp edges of that first meeting in the park had softened into something steady and familiar. James had stepped away from the constant grind of running his company, surprising both his colleagues and the business press with the announcement that he was retiring from the role to focus on personal priorities. Few understood what that meant, but to him, it was simple. His days no longer belonged to boardrooms and shareholders, they belonged to Lily. He became part of her world in a way that felt natural, almost as though it had always been this way. Mornings were for breakfast at the small kitchen table in her grandmother's house, where Lily would chatter about school projects while he packed her lunch. Afternoons might mean trips to the library, afternoons spent drawing side by side, or baking clumsy batches of cookies that somehow disappeared before dinner. He still had business ventures in the background, but they no longer dictated his every move. Lily had grown in those 2 years, not just taller but more confident. The girl who once sat on a park curb with untied laces and downcast eyes now laughed freely, asked endless questions, and spoke her mind without hesitation. She had learned to ride a bike, to play simple songs on the piano, and to hold her ground when other children tried to make her feel small. James knew that some of this came from maturity, but he also knew it came from the knowledge that she was not alone. The walls she had once kept between herself and the world had started to crumble, replaced with a kind of quiet assurance. The truth about their connection was something he had wrestled with for months before telling her. When he finally did, it was on a cool autumn evening, the kind where the air was crisp but not yet harsh. They had been sitting on the porch, the sky streaked with pink and orange, when he told her about Emily, about how he had known her mother long before Lily was born, and how he hadn't known she existed until recently. He kept his voice gentle, letting her guide the pace with her questions. There were tears, and there were silences, but by the time the sun had dipped below the trees, she had leaned against him in a way that told him she had accepted it. That night, she called him Dad for the first time, and the word felt like both a gift and a responsibility heavier than anything he had ever carried. One spring afternoon, they found themselves walking through the same park where they had met. The air was warm and alive with the scent of fresh grass, and Lily, now 7, darted ahead toward the swings. James followed at a slower pace, smiling at the way her hair caught the sunlight. When she jumped off the swing and ran back toward him, she stopped suddenly, crouched down, and took hold of one of his shoes. Without a word, she began tying the lace that had come undone, her small fingers looping and pulling with practiced ease. When she finished, she looked up at him with a mischievous grin. "Now I'm helping you, Dad," she said, and for a moment he could only stand there, caught off guard by the echo of that night 2 years ago. It struck him then how much had changed, not just in her life but in his own. He thought about the man he had been before, driven by ambition, always looking toward the next goal, blind to what he had been missing. Now, standing in the late afternoon sun with Lily's laughter still ringing in his ears, he understood that success had nothing to do with stock prices or influence. It was here, in the easy closeness of this small moment, in the knowledge that she trusted him enough to reach for his laces without asking. As they left the park, her hand slipped naturally into his, and he realized that the life he had now was not something he had planned or earned in the traditional sense. It was something far rarer, a second chance, offered without warning, tied together not by grand gestures or perfect timing, but by the simple, unshakable bond between a father and the daughter he had almost lost before he even knew she existed. And for the first time in a long time, James felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. To me, the ending of this story isn't just about a man finding his daughter, it's about someone who spent years chasing the wrong kind of success and discovering, almost too late, that love and presence are the real measure of a life. James's journey feels like a quiet redemption arc, where the win isn't dramatic or loud, but deeply human. The image of Lily tying his shoelaces at the end works as a perfect full-circle moment. It's simple, almost ordinary, yet it carries the weight of everything they've endured. It reminds me that sometimes the most life-changing moments don't arrive with fanfare, they arrive softly, in the form of someone you love doing something small that means everything.